Hello and welcome to The Digital Insight, the technology, procurement and supply chain podcast that delivers valuable C-level perspective into the core issues surrounding business transformation and digital disruption. Each episode will bring you the most inspiring executive insights from those who are leading transformation strategies within the world's biggest and best-known companies. The Digital Insight. Disrupt, transform, evolve.
Welcome to The Digital Insight, the official podcast series for CPO strategy and interface magazines. My name is Dale, and in today's episode I'm joined by Annie Lee, Vice President of Value Chain Asia at Movado Group. Together, Annie and I look at how we can define supply chain resilience, how it's become a must-have in times of crisis, and we also explore how supply chain resilience can actually be a competitive advantage for business. So, Annie, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Dale.
As a way of finding out a little bit more about yourself and obviously your career journey then, can you introduce yourself and tell us, who you are and what your kind of procurement story is to where you find yourself today?
Okay. I started as a buyer in the pharmaceutical industry in the UK. And a couple of years later, I moved to a multinational electronics company where I further developed my procurement career. I am now responsible for value chain in Asia in a watch and jewelry company. And sourcing is still a key function in my scope. Of course, in addition to logistics, quality, technical, and R&D.
Oh, fantastic. And one thing we like to talk a lot about then on this podcast with people in that kind of supply chain and those procurement disciplines is, I'm not going to put a timeline on it, but definitely in recent years, but let's just say over the last 10 to 15 years, the conversations around procurement, the highlight and the spotlight on procurement has exploded, for lack of a better word. And you said right there about sort of logistics being key, for example, but procurement in general and supply chain, businesses are now saying this is a very key part of the business. It's moved away from the traditional backdoor sort of side office kind of function and is now driving business. It's very strategic, and a lot of businesses are investing their time in centralizing procurement so that it drives business forward. Looking over your career, looking over your experience, and obviously where you are now, how have you seen that kind of evolution unfold?
Well, procurement has developed tremendously in the past 20, even longer time. 20 years ago, procurement actually is a function for people who could not deliver good result in sales and marketing. So if you miss your sales target, okay, you better move to purchasing, give you money to buy something instead of selling something. And now it's a completely different world. Procurement becomes the center of the value chain. And it simply contributes to the bottom line to every company. And I believe procurement as a function can be a competitive advantage for a company.
And how has that changed sort of your, not necessarily your understanding, but your own role? So as the procurement professional, what are the expectations? How have they changed? How has, if you were to go back 10, 15 years, 20 years, looking at what kind of responsibilities you had, looking at the kind of influence that you had, how has it changed? How has that impacted what you do on a day-to-day basis?
Well, as a matter of fact, my career development is a reflection of the increasing importance of procurement function. I always call myself as a buyer, and my core competence, my core skills are in procurement. Now I have the opportunity to extend my scope to even broader on top of procurement in supply chain or in value chain. And in terms of procurement itself, 20 years ago, we focus a lot on the PO management, the administrative work, and a little bit of price negotiation, cost management. But along the time, it's developed to quality improvement, reliability increase, all the area. And nowadays, procurement has extended to much broader to supply-based management, supply relationship management, even to now, sustainability, digitization of the supply chain, resilience, flexibility, agility, you name it. So procurement actually to me has been more intensified and has become true profession and requires high skills in all areas.
And you've touched upon a question that I was going to ask about. So you've talked about the scope, the broadening of that scope, and how it's really kind of forced a bit of a huge rethink from everybody within procurement. When I talk to people, when I write about procurement, I see a lot of headlines that focus on, like you've said before, you mentioned technology there, for example, they focus on cost savings, because these are the kind of the traditional obvious things that procurement would focus on. But you've talked about sustainability there. You mentioned, resilience. You've talked about supplier relationships becoming more integral to the conversations. Looking at it from a board level, then, so you're a procurement professional. You understand the importance of supplier relationships from day one. But how has the kind of board level expectation changed? How has the non-procurement professional how's their understanding of what the key things are to supply chains and procurement? How have they changed, and how are those conversations changing in that regard?
Well, I think for the people out of supply chain or out of procurement, they experience the change by seeing the impact of procurement. Basically, if we have a good strategic partnership with our supplier, then in the time of crisis, for example, in this pandemic, well, when you have a very successful partnership with supplier, you will have the advantage of getting more capacity when anybody else doesn't have the supply. So by having more capacity, will make our salespeople, make our finance people know, oh, procurement is at the end very important because they are really securing our supply to enable the sales.
So one thing then you've mentioned, and I know it's a key focus of your career, and it's something that obviously you're focusing a lot on right now, is supply chain resilience. And again, looking at it from a sort of a top level broad perspective, these are sort of words that I hear a lot about. I hear a lot of people mention supply chain resilience in the same breath as supplier relationships or sustainability. And to the point where actually the definition of that perhaps gets lost. It gets lost in the sense of, well, this is what we're doing. But I'd like to ask, what does it actually mean? What does supply chain resilience actually mean to you and to the procurement and supply chain professional?
To me, supply chain resilience is actually the ability to bounce back quickly to the norm situation with even better, higher performance. It's actually the capability to recover from the huge disruption and the big difficulties.
Obviously, then there's one kind of big difficulty happening right now with the pandemic, and we will jump into that a little bit in a moment. But just kind of going back to a point where the pandemic wasn't something that we'd even considered. So let's just say the start of the year. I know it's been sort of happening at different stages for a long time now, but prior to 2020, prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, where do you think, or what do you think these sort of conversations around supply chain resilience were like prior to this? Because obviously right now the importance and significance has shot up, but previously perhaps had it been sort of pushed to the wayside. Like, where was the general conversation around resilience and supply chain prior to this year?
Well, before the pandemic, we talk about supply chain agility a lot. I remember we spent hours to talk about agility, how to measure our agility as a KPI in our management meeting. Well, in fact, agility is indeed a very important factor for our supply chain. And to me, agility is the high adaptability and flexibility for supply chain. But agility is without the focus on huge difficulty and toughness, like the situation of currently, the pandemic. So resilience is really to bounce back from the bottom, from the very tough situation like now. And the agility is just missing this bounce back factor. So before the pandemic, well, we focused on agility. And now I think resilience is more relevant.
So let's sort of jump into the shoes of the professional then, who's looking to improve, to reinvigorate, to kind of realign procurement, to really essentially build supply chain resilience. It sounds quite lofty. It sounds quite a challenge. Where does one even begin? So where would you even start to make changes, to sort of make bigger changes further down the line? Like, how do you begin that kind of process?
Well, in order to improve the resilience of supply chain, I think it's critical to have the risk management on top of the management agenda. Anticipate risk, prepare measures, and optimize actions for different scenarios before any type of disturbance or disruption can mitigate the impact of the risk. And also high transparency of end-to-end value chain is another critical factor. From the customer to our own company, our planning process, to our finished goods supplier, and even to our supplier's supplier, which means the second tier, third tier suppliers. Only when we have the full transparency can we react fast with the whole picture in mind. So to me, I would start from risk management and work on the end-to-end value chain transparency.
So the benefits are very clear. And again, speaking to a number of people, a lot of people have told me about why this is ideal, why this is kind of what more and more people need to be doing. And it sounds, obviously everything on paper sounds simple, sounds easy, but we know it's a very complex ecosystem. There's a lot of moving parts. What are some of the sort of key challenges that, I know there's going to be specific challenges between businesses and whatnot, but just looking at it from a broad perspective, what are kind of the key challenges that one would face when looking at building supply chain resilience?
My learning in this pandemic is actually supply chain resilience requires a balance between supporting the company top line and bottom line. So when the disaster strikes, the company is, well, at least my company is laser focused on cash flow, which means supply chain needs to manage the inventory carefully. We are looking at our inventory on a daily basis. But when company is on the way to recovery, then the supply chain will have to ensure sufficient supply because our sales is fighting in the front line and we are actually supplying goods for them to sell. So the balance between sufficient supply and inventory control becomes one of the biggest challenge for supply chain and even for the whole company.
Obviously then, with what's going on then, with the pandemic and with the sort of challenges in general when it comes to procurement, there's a lot of, and when we're trying to make changes, there's a lot of pressure, there's a lot of pressure. There's a lot of eyes on procurement and supply chain because you're spending a lot of money, you're making big changes, people are going to want to see results. Obviously, like we say, challenges are always going to come up and you're always going to have to face those challenges, but sometimes the challenges can be too tough, and in some cases you're not going to be able to overcome those challenges, and you have to kind of rethink, take stock, and take a different path. How important is it to talk about that and to sort of communicate when the challenges are just too much or when things haven't worked out, as opposed to just sort of championing the successes?
Well, I have to admit, well, sometimes, well, things just can't work out. Well, I hear from the management meeting from my sales colleague making comments saying, if I had enough stock, if I have enough supply, I would have increased myself by 10%, by 15%. So in that situation, well, I would call it, it didn't work out to me. Um, well, we will have to say at the end, well, when we reach the quarter end, when we reach the year end, we will have to look at the top line and the bottom line. So it's not only to look at how much sales, we have to look at our margin and also our inventory level. Especially with this pandemic, we are talking about cash is the king. So if we don't manage our inventory, we don't have the right cash flow, then we can't invest in marketing. How can we support more sales? So these are the things we need to continuously communicate with our sales team, align with our sales team and with our management to reach consensus.
And you talk about that kind of continuous conversation with sales and with management, and that's kind of dealing with sort of the external facing sides of the business. When we talk about procurement, sometimes it's very easy to just focus on the internal perspective, to focus on, well, this is great for internal process, it's great for kind of building competencies inside the business. But I'm always curious to wonder how that reflects externally. So can resilience be seen as a competitive advantage for a business? Having such great supply chain resilience, is that actually something that can make your business stand out and stand tall above another business?
Yes, definitely. Resilience is actually a key capability for supply chain and for value chain. And when I say value chain, it extends to the company, our customer, and it even extend to downstream to our suppliers supplier. For our company, well, I call my company a resilient company. In the past, we have experienced a lot of challenging situation, like 2003 we had SARS, 2008 we have the financial crisis, and 2011 there was earthquake and tsunami in Japan. In watch industry, it was a huge impact because our movements are mainly from Japan. So we have our key components completely out of supply. So, but because of the resilience of our company and the supply chain, we gain more market share after the crisis simply because we react fast. At the time when there was earthquake and tsunami, well, when we secure our capacity of key component, price was not looked at. Basically, we fight for capacity, and that I call it resilience, and that has proven to be the competitive advantage to enable our company to gain market share after the crisis. So when a player is in shortage, when our competitors were in shortage, our resilient supply chain recovered faster. We get the supply, get the products earlier than our competitor, and that enables our sales ahead of our competitor, which enable us to win market share.
When talking then about procurement, and when talking about, like you said then, sort of a competitive advantage and a growth in market share and doing, working with sales and boosting productivity, cash flow, and that sort of thing, we're kind of talking very much about sort of figures, statistics, and data. And I always say this, I always ask this about people because it can be, and rightly so sometimes, it can be quite easy to forget that also when we're dealing with all this change, when we're looking at supply chain resilience, it has to start somewhere, and it will start with the people in the business. It'll have to start with the supply chain and the procurement professional. I've said in my notes here that sort of you can have all the best processes put in place, but if you've not got the right people with the right skill sets, with the right mindsets and the right culture, those processes are worthless. So tell me a little bit then about the significance, the role that people have to play in establishing and solidifying something like supply chain resilience.
Well, in fact, people is a key factor of supply chain resilience. As human beings, we all have the quality of resilience. And as a manager, it is our responsibility to enhance the resilience of each of our team members in workplace. If everyone in our office increase the resilience, the teams will improve the resilience. And then the supply chain organization will be more resilient. So we just need our people to have that quality. And as a manager, we boost that quality as a team, as an organization. Then we can react faster to the change, to the risk, to the shock, to the impact. Then we can recover faster than others.
Again, I talk a lot about kind of transformation programs. I talk a lot about changing cultures. And again, it's something that's easier said than done. It's easy to say on paper, we're going to be investing, or we're going to be spending a lot of time making sure that people are switched on and engaged with what we're doing. But ultimately, we're human beings, and change can sometimes cause a little bit of resistance. It cannot simply just go to plan because there's so many things you can't take into consideration. And as we change and as procurement continues to evolve and supply chain evolves, no one can stand still. You might invest in people now, but then 2 to 3 months from now, something could happen that could require a different type of change, a different type of approach. How do you go about ensuring then that you are constantly looking and assessing those competencies and ensuring that the people that you have are the right people, that they are equipped with the right skills, that they are switched on where they need to be switched on and not stand still once you've overcome one certain challenge?
I think communication to the teams is critical. Be a leader with deliberate calm, with bounded optimism in this pandemic, in this crisis situation, and also share the business status, the current status, and the outlook, and make our people understand where the company is going, where the team and the organization is going, can motivate the team to follow the company direction.
So we've already talked about then a little bit COVID-19 and what that's done in terms of how it's kind of furthered the need and the requirement for a resilience within the supply chain, and how it's made that kind of skyrocket to the very top of people's agendas. But what I also like to look at is how is it forced to the hands of many people, both businesses and people and leaders and chairmen and board levels, to kind of take stock and actually what might have worked for them up until now, maybe perhaps now they need to stop and think about changing that and evolve and do something new as this, I don't want to use the word new normal, but as this pandemic has created a new playing field. So how has it forced people to look at their businesses and look at their supply chain strategies and think differently as to before?
Well, the COVID-19 is unprecedented with huge impact to the whole world. And to supply chain, it has been the biggest challenge ever, I would say. Well, in February, right after the Chinese New Year, the Chinese factory were locked down. And then in March, April time, the suppliers in China were back to work with limited capacity. But Europe and US key markets were locked down. And then after May, Europe and US gradually started reopen their shops. And then the capacity of Chinese supplier became insufficient. So if you look at the whole time of this pandemic, the demand and supply are never in balance. And it's always is either too little or a little bit too more. Okay, So in such situations, supply chain resilience becomes more important than ever. Well, the supply challenge has been highly visible to all business and to all the people. It's not only a supply chain challenge anymore. Everybody knows in the company, well, we are having a supply situation. We have a huge challenge. The importance of supply and prioritization of supply has been taken to the highest level, in the board level, in the management team level, and it's being reviewed on weekly basis. It never happened in the past. So there is a special meeting talking about supply situation, and there is a cross-functional top management people trying to align how to prioritize our supply and how to focus on the right customer at the right timing. So these are all the things. Well, I think it's the adaptation to the new situation.
Rather than look at the sort of the challenges and how those challenges have been magnified and made even more challenging, with the pandemic, I'd like to look at the sort of the positives. So, what could you turn around and say has actually been a good thing to have come out of this whole last sort of year or so, in terms of how it's made procurement more of a recognised key part of the business, or how it's kind of forced that rethink? Like, tell me some things that you think are actually positives to take away from the last 10 to 12 months.
Well, I think the importance of supply chain or procurement becomes more visible, and risk management becomes a necessity. It's something we have to put on the management agenda. And another positive change is actually this pandemic is actually a burning platform for every company. And when you have a burning platform, when you want to drive change, then the acceptance of the change will become easier. For example, digitization. Well, US used to take 10 years to drive digitization, and within 3 months, they can achieve the number which they didn't achieve in the past 10 years. And plenty of example, because of the pandemic, things actually changed, and people have to adapt into the new situation.
People kind of think that whatever the future is going to be, that we're going to sort of revert back to some old habits. That's no matter how much change has happened, eventually things are going to return to a sense of similarity to what came before. But I'm of the belief that actually there is no going back to some degree. In one podcast, someone turned around and told me that we could almost rip up the rule book in terms of what we thought supply chain and supply chain resilience meant, because this is forced a complete, rethink of everything. Do you think that the changes that we've seen, the new ways of working, so to speak, they are here for good, or that there will be a kind of a stepping back to what was, only as recently as last year in terms of how we approached supply chain and supply chain resilience?
Well, I think COVID-19 has changed the whole world, and we will never go back to what we wore in before the pandemic. There will be a new normal post-pandemic. A very simple example, business travel will be reduced significantly. And the video conference, Zoom, Teams, or whatever, Google or Skype, will, and it will reduce the travel expense tremendously. And we will have to adapt into the new business world, no matter what we want or not. We just need to, and we just have to.
And looking at the changes, then I hope it's not a difficult question, but it's one that I like to ask people: is that we've all seen some good change. We've all, you've already talked about some. We've already seen things that we've had to change ourselves in terms of how we approach just our daily lives, but also our ways of working. What is one change, one thing you've seen that from a supply chain perspective that I wouldn't say wouldn't have happened anyway, or perhaps COVID has brought this change on quicker than before, but like it's one change that you are very, very glad to have happened, to have seen, something that now you can't imagine not having that change in place, if that makes sense.
Well, we talk about the positive side of the COVID-19. What positive change the COVID-19 brought us? Well, I hope all the positive things can stay, but if I weight them, I would think risk management. The sense of risk management is a very, very important thing. I hope it can stay, and not only in supply chain function, but in order function, in order company, put risk management as normal process and go through this regularly.
And final question then, and it's something again I like to ask everybody because no two answers are the same. Everybody has their own unique take and unique approach to work, but we cannot guarantee success, of course not, but we all sort of have a way, an approach that we think works for us, that brings success for us in a certain kind of way. Looking at your experience, looking at your, the worldview that you have, looking at kind of the position you're in now and what you've been up to, what's one sort of piece of advice or what's one sort of key thing that you believe is crucial to achieving any form of success?
I believe high adaptability to the forever changing world has been the key to achieve any form of success. Adapt to market situation, adapt to digital transformation, adapt to new business direction in our company, adapt to new generation of workforce are all key factors to any success.
Excellent. Annie, thank you for joining me on the podcast.
Thank you for listening to the Digital Insight Podcast in association with the Interface.net and CPOstrategy.com. The Digital Insight is brought to you by B2E Media Limited. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Please remember to subscribe, rate and review. And don't forget to check out our podcast archive at www.b2e-media.com/The Digital Insight.